Welcome to the Future of Resolution, Miles Mediation and Arbitration's podcast. Today's episode focuses on the critical topic of mental health and wellness in the legal profession. We're joined by co-host and Miles neutral Bianca Motley Broom, and our guest, Frazer Clarke, who's a plaintiff's attorney and the 50th president of the State Bar of Georgia, as well as Jonathan Ringel, who's the editor of the Daily Report. We also have Stacey Dougan. Stacey's a lawyer and therapist based in Atlanta who works with attorneys and law firms.
It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We're all aware of the mental health challenges attorneys face, particularly in big law. Attorneys experience higher rates of depression, alcoholism, anxiety, and exhaustion more than any other professional group. It's a serious issue, and there's finally more awareness around it. We're having conversations about what needs to change in the practice of law so that attorney well-being is deemed as important as professional success. Jonathan, last year you oversaw a Daily Report study that allowed attorneys to provide feedback about their mental health challenges. Can you share some of your findings to give our audience an idea of the scope of the problem and kick off our discussion?
Sure. The study wasn't scientific in any way. It was completely anecdotal, but we just asked lawyers in our readership to share their stress stories. And what we received was an interesting array of experiences. It ranged from one public sector attorney who was, by my estimation, close to a crisis, and this person reached out and just said that he or she was seeking therapy and on medication, but clearly didn't seem comfortable with it. And what was remarkable was the number of attorneys who contacted me, we did not name this person, who offered to meet with this person and help. That was very gratifying. That was the only story we heard that was really of somebody who needed help and thankfully was getting it. We heard from a number of people who said that they had various levels of stress and that they had found ways to cope with it, ranging from things like exercise and prayer and people getting involved in hobbies, which may sound very simple, but clearly made a difference to these people. One of the most telling responses I recall was one lawyer who wrote in that said, when somebody asks you, how are you doing? And people say, oh, I'm so busy. In fact, I just told that to Robin a few minutes ago, that it's not an accomplishment to say that you're so busy, but people feel like it necessary to say that they're so busy. It's as if stress is their sort of default state. I mean, Cindy can talk about this. That's not a healthy way to live. One last thing I think I'll mention is the story that we ran last year quoted an ABA and Betty Ford at Hazelden study that these numbers were remarkable. 3 of 10 lawyers are depressed, and 2 of 10 have anxiety or problem drinking. So, I mean, if you just imagine a conference room of 10 lawyers, half of them are going through something pretty extraordinary, and probably, this is just my personal take on it, you wouldn't tell. It's not like they're sitting in a conference room drinking or freaking out, but inside they are. And so you can only imagine the amount of stress and energy it takes for that person to hold it in while they're at a meeting or in a negotiation or in court.
Robin, I know that you spearheaded initiatives for the State Bar in terms of attorney wellness and helping with mental health issues. What led you to even do that in the first place?
Well, it wasn't on my platform as president of the State Bar, but it fell in my lap, and it became so patently obvious that I felt like if I didn't do something, that I would be shirking my duties to my fellow bar members and to our community. But when I was president of the State Bar, we had several lawyers kill themselves, and one was a very dear friend of mine. When I first got sworn in, it happened almost immediately after I was sworn in. And then there was a succession of them, and I just felt like we had to do something. And before then, our bar did have a very good lawyer assistance program, but we weren't getting the message out to members clearly. We were not telling them that there is help, that they had counseling. In fact, there's free counseling through your membership in the bar. But we were not getting the word out, so I felt like we had to really emphasize it and make a point about it and get the message out there. We had one lawyer, after my dear friend resorted to suicide, we had one lawyer who resorted to suicide in the State Bar parking lot. And you can't, I suppose you could ignore that. As a fellow human being, I could not ignore it. So I felt like we had to do something. And that's when we started our How to Save a Life program, and we kicked that off, all dealing first with suicide prevention, and then we added other mental health aspects and wellness to it. But I'm very proud of that. And I also want to, since Jonathan's here, I do want to say thank you to Jonathan, because he's always been willing to allow us space in the Daily Report to talk about this issue, allow us to do op-eds for Suicide Awareness Week. I got a lot of stories, but my favorite story about this issue is when we decided to launch this program, How to Save a Life. Jonathan put a journalist on it, and I think it was Greg Land, to write just about the beginning of it. We really hadn't even gotten it out there, but we're going to start with an article to those folks who read the Daily Report, lawyers who need this help. And Greg wrote an article and talked about the program and what we're trying to do and the lawyer assistance program. Now we're going to have How to Save a Life, suicide prevention. And the article comes out that night. Another member of the bar got in touch with Chuck Pecor, who was in charge of the lawyer assistance program at that time, and said she was in desperate need of help. She was suicidal. She was in a downward spiral that night, and in fact had gone to her home after a horrible day in court and had decided to take her life. Read the article, reached out to Chuck Pecor, and Chuck immediately went over, met with her, got her counseling the next morning, and prevented her from attempting suicide. And so the next day, Greg Land happened to be covering something else that I was at University of Georgia Law School doing as part of presidential duties, and Greg was there covering that. And Chuck had called me that morning to say, we prevented another lawyer from taking her life. And I went to Greg after our thing and walked him to the car, and I said, Greg, I told him the whole story. I said, Greg, I want you to know your article saved a life, and you should go back to your office and be proud of this and tell everyone about it. I don't know how many journalists get to say they absolutely saved a life, but your article saved a life. Go be proud of that, and thank you. It's an incredible story, and I think it also says just talking about the issue is so helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So thank you, Jonathan, for
You're very welcome.
For doing that.
If I'm lucky enough someday to win a Pulitzer, I don't think that will top this. So I can remember that day, and I was telling somebody about that just last week. That was probably the most important story we've ever written. I
would agree, and I'm just so thankful y'all printed that story, and it saved a life.
Us too.
I mean, in that same ABA Hazelton study, it said that 11.5% of lawyers had suicidal thoughts. Mm-hmm. And so this is not something that is completely off the radar. We've got a profession that is really suffering. One of the other things that was interesting in that study was that the two most common barriers for people preventing them from seeking help was that they didn't want others to find out that they needed help.
Right.
And they had concerns regarding privacy and confidentiality. So, Robin, can you talk a little bit about how the State Bar's program works and how it protects individuals in regard to those things?
We want to emphasize that everything is confidential. And I think one of the barriers to reaching out for help for lawyers is they're scared that the minute they pick up the phone to ask for help, it's like a direct line to the general counsel's office, and they're going to be looking at discipline. And I just want to emphasize that is absolutely not the case. You call into our lawyer assistance program, you are connected with a therapist or a psychologist, and they are completely separate. They're a completely separate professional team, not employees of the State Bar, and our general counsel's office has no idea you're calling and never will. So I want to emphasize that. That's one of the big worries is, I'll lose my license if I get help. No, you won't lose your license. You will get the help you need. So please understand, folks, reach out. It won't go to general counsel, and they won't know about it. It's totally confidential.
Stacey, in your capacity as a lawyer and a therapist, what are you seeing and hearing? Obviously, you can't discuss details because of doctor-patient confidentiality, but we'd love to hear your perspective.
This has been a great conversation, and I thank you all for inviting me to participate. It is so important that we're finally paying attention to what we've known for a really long time, which is that lawyers are struggling, and it's not getting any better. In fact, it's getting worse. What I know from my clients is that lawyers are largely suffering in silence. One of the first things I do with my clients is I share with them the statistics that we've been talking about today because I want them to feel less isolated and alone. I asked one client if he shares his struggle with coworkers at his firms, and he said, we're all wearing masks at the office. And so everybody seems fine. Nobody's sharing their struggles. Nobody's sharing their vulnerabilities. Now, on the bright side, I recently worked with a firm where one of the leaders shared publicly that he had recently started seeing a therapist because he just felt like he wasn't showing up as his best self at either the firm or for his family. And interestingly, he was also very intentional about telegraphing how he was going to respond to emails during his vacation. He wanted to model how you don't have to try to fit in a whole day's work while you're gallivanting through Europe. And so it was really important for him to show that he didn't have to be available 24/7, that he had capacity. And again, this was really intentional on his part. So I thought it was really a great example to provide for people all throughout the firm, actually, because these messages have to come from the top. They don't start at associate committees. They don't start with the younger leaders. They have to start from the top if we really want to destigmatize these conversations. Now, listen, unfortunately, I mean, that leader is an exception. He's not the rule. And we have a lot of work to do around spreading this message. And, the nature of the profession doesn't help at all. Lawyers rank among the lowest of any professional population in terms of resilience and empathy. And I tell my clients this all the time because even if they're resilient and empathetic themselves, it's important for them to know that they're usually surrounded by people who aren't. And that makes for a tough environment. And let's face it, lawyers usually bring a healthy dose of ego to their lives as well. We're the ones that people come to for answers. We're supposed to have the answers, not the questions. And the competitive adversarial nature of the profession, it just has the combined effect of causing lawyers to think that asking for help is a sign of weakness, not strength. And the research tells us this. The research tells us that the number one reason that lawyers don't ask for help is because they're afraid it will diminish them professionally. That is a catch-22 that is really, really problematic and then just perpetuates these problems. It really compounds on itself, and we've just got to get out of this knot. And finally, if I can just swing back to Jonathan's point about the depression and substance abuse among lawyers, the research tells us that up to 70% of legal malpractice and disciplinary claims stem directly from lawyers' substance abuse and depression. Now, I think that's catastrophic. And I can tell you, after having been the assistant general counsel at a big law firm, there is nothing more devastating to a lawyer than being sued for malpractice or having a disciplinary claim. And you can just imagine how that trauma is compounded when the claim is actually attached to a lawyer's personal mental health struggles.
For law firms that may not truly hear what we're saying here today, let's make a business case for this. Why is it important for law firms to care about attorney well-being? Why should they care?
Their lawyers do be more productive. In another story we did, there was a tragic episode in the fall where a lawyer in Los Angeles took his own life, and his wife wrote an article for American Lawyer, or one of our affiliates. And this was, to me, the most heartbreaking part of the story was he said at a point when it was clear he was suffering, that they had thought about going to the hospital to get some help. And he said, if we do this, my career is over. And in talking to other lawyers, including lawyers who've very openly said they've wrestled in successful treatment, for mental health problems, they've said that's not true. One partner at Quinn Emanuel, I believe he's a partner, up in New York, told a very compelling story. One of the things he told me in the article I wrote was that the stigma is really over-feared. It's not that saying I need help will get you help, and no one's going to think less of you for that. And as another partner at a big firm told me, it really doesn't matter. This person was saying, you've got everything to lose and nothing to gain by suffering in silence. And that in the end, you're going to be able to advise your clients much more successfully if you get treatment. If you had kidney failure, no one would say, you really need to be at that negotiation tomorrow instead of being, at the doctor. And they're really, I hope these discussions take care of that stigma and put it where it needs to go, because it really is, it's a very personal problem, and that's why people may not want to talk about it, or certainly in specifics. But in the end, law firms are smart to get these, are seeing, at least saying that they're working on these matters because it's not only the right thing to do for the people that work with them, but also it will keep their firm intact.
One of the things we also tried to do when we were starting out our program is go to legal malpractice insurance carriers and demonstrate that if a law firm had a mental wellness or suicide prevention program in place and were constantly working on it, that they could lower their premiums. So that's a business reason. And my friend Randy Evans, a great guy, he worked on this program with me, and he represents a lot of lawyers and legal malpractice insurance carriers, and he went to many carriers asking them to agree to reduce premiums if a firm can demonstrate they have an ongoing mental health campaign in their firm, which, as Stacey said, only makes sense because if you are paying attention to that, legal malpractice claims go down, so your premium should go down. Now, that's a actual business, I can demonstrate this will help you save money. That's one good reason, but forget that. The reason you should do it is who's your neighbor? Who should you reach out? Who's in your community? Are you going to ignore somebody in pain, or are you going to reach a hand out and say, let me help you? As a human being on a human level, and it may be a religious thing for you. It is for me. It's part of my faith, and I'm sure it's part of a lot of people's faith. But you say, am I going to ignore someone suffering, or am I going to reach out and help? That's the real reason, I think.
Actually, if I could ask a question of Robin and Stacey, if it's okay with you guys. I'm curious how lawyers in small firms or solos can manage this. We hear a lot of stories from the big firms, and we know a big firm, as busy as everybody is there, has the resources to shift a matter over to another partner somewhere or another associate. I'm curious, what's your recommendation for solos and people in small firms where their clients may have an issue coming up in 2 weeks in court, and this may not seem like a good time to go get help?
Stacey, I'll let you handle that first.
We've recently heard about big law firms hiring wellness officers in the C-suite and engaging in all kinds of high-profile activities that small firms and solos they don't have the capacity to do it. But that said, small firms can actually be really nimble and more nimble than large firms when it comes to addressing these issues and sussing out problems, because people just tend to be more visible. It's harder for people to fly under the radar if they're struggling. The bottom line is that there's just no one-size-fits-all approach to lawyer well-being. Firms really need to customize based on their own unique culture and environment. But one great resource I do want to make sure I mention is the Georgia Bar Living Well Committee. They have amassed a treasure trove of resources in the lawyer well-being area. And the lawyers that serve on the committee really know this subject matter, so they can be ambassadors and sort of experts in their own right. And then there's also the ABA Wellbeing Toolkit, which is a monster document, but that's because they have really compiled an enormous amount of resources, policies, activities, all kinds of tools for legal employers to use, to figure out, do I want to have a policy? Do I want to do an audit? How do I want to figure this out? So I guess what I would say is anything that small firms or solos can do to destigmatize mental health issues and support help-seeking behavior, and that really applies in any environment. But even if it's a brown bag lunch with a local therapist who talks about, how do I help somebody I think may have a problem, that moves the conversation along.
That's cool. I'm a sole practitioner, so I know what you're talking about, Jonathan, and have many friends who are sole practitioners, and it is an added level of stress to be the only lawyer in the office. I think as a practical matter, you surround yourself with good support. I've got a great paralegal, and I've got a great partner spouse. I could not do it without my husband, and I think that's very important. Then beyond that, you go outside of that circle, and then you got to have really supportive friends. So I have a group of friends that know I can call on them to cover something. If I'm in a crisis, physically, mentally, whatever, I can call on them to cover something, and they would do it without a blink of an eye, and they know I would do that for them. I think you have to have this social network, as Stacey was talking about, to support you as well. You cannot do it on your own. You think as a sole practitioner, you may think you're doing it on your own. That's a joke. You can't do it on your own. I also think talking about this helps that if you ever have to approach the court to say, Judge, I just can't go forward 2 weeks from today, is your example. I just can't do it. They are going to be so more understanding than they were, in my opinion, than, say, 30 years ago when no one talked about this. So I think just, again, the conversation helps.
Jonathan, I know ALM has a series that they've rolled out recently called Mind Matters.
Minds over matters.
I'm sorry,
yes.
Minds Over
That's okay,
Matter.
yes.
I apologize. And one of the interesting articles in there from James Dolan had a quote that I thought is probably one of the fundamental problems in how we're dealing with the legal profession at this point. He said, contemporary law practice implicitly and explicitly asks lawyers to make it their only priority. There's an inbuilt fear that says if you don't make it your only priority, you'll lose out. You'll be a failure.
Right. That's a great point.
And I think we need to get that conversation happening that there needs to be more than the law. About 6 years ago, I started making pottery. And it's been an amazing way for me to have something else besides the law at the focus of my life. And so I'd love to hear what types of things the three of you think will really help lawyers outside of the law and sort of help them flesh out the rest of their life so the practice is not their only priority.
That's interesting. The piece that we did last year where we asked people to send in their stress stories, a number of the responses we got were, here's how I deal with stress. A number of people said just getting outside, literally outside the office, in the air, in the sun, makes a difference. I found personally just taking a walk around the block is amazingly helpful. And certainly people with various interests ranging from prayer, meditation, and everything, golf, frisbee golf. One of the first articles we got in response to our request came from somebody who said, I'm into frisbee golf. I think on the same day I got that was the same day we got the note from the lawyer who was really having a tough time. And I just thought we're really getting every aspect to this. To me, what's striking about the profession is that it makes sense that lawyers would be all consumed by it because for a lot of clients, it's all consuming. They think something terrible has happened to them and an injustice. And I've known people personally and certainly seen in my professional life how the clients are overcome with thoughts about this terrible thing that has occurred to them that led them to hire a lawyer to say, I want a court to declare that I'm right and the other guy is wrong. Add to that the fact that these are the kinds of disputes that 500 years ago people had wars over or killed each other over. And the lawyers have to contain all this stress that from their client, and then of course there's their own personal stuff. But I think one thing that lawyers have a very strong ability to do is compartmentalize. And if they can use those skills that keep them level-headed when their clients or the opposing counsel is being emotional, if they can use that same compartmentalization to set aside their work at the end of the day at an appropriate time and go for a run, play with their child, play with their dog, watch TV, do something, I think that might be helpful. I'm not a mental health professional, so I can't speak to what's officially helpful. That is what I've seen.
I like the pottery idea because I see the stress coming out of your fingertips. And I needlepoint, so I can feel myself when I'm starting to get stressed. I'm like, I just need to sit down and needlepoint because I feel like the stress comes out. But also, I golf, so that's a very good. Both you're outside, man versus nature. You're outside enjoying that, and hopefully the company of your good friend or spouse, which my husband and I play a lot together, and vacation. And I think one of the hardest things for lawyers is when they go on vacation, they don't really go on vacation. They worry about what's going on in their office. I know I do, and I have to tell myself, really go on vacation. First time I went to Europe, I didn't take a laptop, and I thought I was going to just die. But as it turns out, lots of hotels have laptops or computers. If you feel a need, you can get on it. But lawyers have to say, I'm really going to go on vacation. Nothing's going to happen in the 2 weeks that I'm gone. It'll all be there when I get back. And just enjoy time away. That's what I think helps.
Yeah. Randy wrote some columns for the Daily Report, a lot of columns about legal practice. In one column, I recall, he and his partner, Sherry Clevens, wrote about the importance of, preparing for vacation so that you can do exactly what you were saying, which is really be on vacation. And it's very practical things such as, making sure that your phone messages say, if this is an emergency, contact, a secretary or, an associate or a partner, And of course, I know that the lawyers have plenty of obligations to tell courts and opposing counsel that they're not going to be available. But it sounds like just some early preparation can go a long way in making it easier for a lawyer to go on vacation.
Stacey, I know your website talks fairly extensively about your commitment to mindfulness and encouraging that with some of your clients. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. It's one of my favorite topics. So if I asked you if you can control other people, places, and things, you'd probably smile and say, no, of course not. And yet when you think about it, we spend a lot of our time, all of us spend a lot of our time trying to do just that. For lawyers, there is so much happening that is simply outside of our control. And given that lawyers tend to be kind of controlling personalities, this can be pretty challenging. But when you think about it, how do you control a court docket? How do you control the timing of a client's emergency, or a judge's ruling, or a jury's verdict, or opposing counsel's mood? Mindfulness is the most powerful tool I know of to help remind us of what we can control, which is us, and what we can't control, which is everything else. And there's a wonderful quote by Viktor Frankl that I really love and I share with my clients frequently, which is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. And how I use that quote is to help clients understand the neurobiology of stress and how it affects the way they behave. When we're stuck in fight and flight, where we get hijacked by things like a phone call or a last-minute research project or, a partner yelling at us, we get hijacked by our limbic brain, which is the emotional part of the brain, and we literally lose access to the prefrontal cortex, which is where logic and reason live. We can't think straight, and that's what happens when we're under stress. So one way I like to talk to people about mindfulness is talking about the power of the pause. Taking that pause, using that space that Frankl describes, we can choose how to respond in a particular situation rather than simply reacting to it. And we all have had the experience of mindlessly reacting, and usually it does not feel good. And the science shows us that the benefits of mindfulness in terms of quieting reactivity, enhancing cognitive flexibility, quieting that inner critic, these benefits can really be profound. And it's really important to note the backdrop against which this is all happening. Lawyers have every reason to be stressed. We're in a hyper-competitive adversarial environment riddled with distractions. So slowing down, a lot of times it just doesn't even feel like an option. But we also know, and that's why we're all sitting here around this table, that continuing at this pace is just not sustainable. So what I spend a lot of time talking to my clients about is building capacity. Talking about the things that we've been talking about so far today. Hobbies, being in nature, meditating, eating well, sleeping. The bottom line is that we need to do that which we feel like we can't. I don't have time for that. Well, it's really not even discretionary at this point. I don't have time to cook. I don't have time to go outside. What we're learning, and for some of us we're learning it the hard way, is that we can't afford not to do these things.
So I'd like to share just some information about an article that I came across by Larry Krieger. It was published in the New York Times, and ironically, it was the top article for 2 straight days on the New York Times website. I mean, it had the highest amount of page views, unsurprisingly, because it's such an important issue. The title of the article is "What Makes Lawyers Happy? A Data-Driven Prescription to Redefine Professional Success." In the article, Larry outlines 4 critical sources of happiness for attorneys. And a lot of what we've discussed here align with what Larry prescribes in his article. The first is authenticity and autonomy. The second source is relatedness, so that sense of social connection that we've talked about here today. The third is competence. And the fourth is internal motivation. So the biggest takeaway in reading this article was that at any time an attorney can make a decision about what they need to do for themselves without fear of losing their jobs or of judgment. And I know that we've talked about that a lot today. So for anyone listening, I highly recommend that article. It's called "What Makes Lawyers Happy? A Data-Driven Prescription to Redefine Professional Success."
So, Marcie, may I say something about that?
Of course.
It's an incredible article, and I have so much respect for Professor Krieger's work. It's really important. What I think is so important to recognize is what he found is that the factors most highly correlated with lawyers' happiness and sense of subjective well-being are intrinsic. Whether we feel like what we do matters, whether we feel connected to others, whether we feel a sense of mastery in our work, that all comes from within. And yet the legal profession remains stubbornly extrinsically focused. I mean, factors like prestige, law review, salary, making money, making partner, that's the emphasis. And the bottom line is, and Larry has a great chart in his article that really illustrates this, is that we have it backwards. The priorities emphasized by the legal profession are the antitheses of what lawyers are saying makes them happy. And until we figure this out and get it straight, we're going to continue to see struggling and suffering in this profession.
Stacey, I think that's a great segue to one of the takeaways that I had from the ABA study. Actually, they found that junior associates had the highest rate of problematic substance use, and that it's actually impacting people in the first 10 years of the profession more than even folks who are farther along in their careers. And so that made me think, are we talking about this too late? Should we be having these discussions while folks are in law school, so they have the ability to actually have those tools to cope when they're faced with these situations? Because James Dolan also noted that the best stress management strategies are those already in place when the stress mounts. So we're almost behind the ball in some ways because we're trying to address problems that people are already having. And so if we start having these discussions about mental health and wellness when people are just at the cusp of their careers before that second year sets in and the priorities shift, then we've already given them the tools in their toolbox to handle those things down the road. I'd love to hear what the three of you think about that.
I think it sounds like a great idea. We'll have to talk about it with the law schools.
I know I participated in at least one mental health event. I don't know what they called it, a seminar or something that was mandatory for students at Emory Law School, my alma mater. And I believe it was back when I was president, maybe shortly after. But they are making an effort to say, because I think suicide rate, Stacey can probably tell us, but suicide rate among law students is unfortunately very high. And so some law schools are making an effort to talk exactly what you're saying, like put some strategies in place now. It's only going to get worse. I know law students think this is it. I've got to make it. I've got to be in the top 10%. I've got to do all this stuff or I'll have no life. And the truth is, that's really nothing compared to when you're sitting next to your client who, if you lose, he's going to prison for the rest of your life. That's real stress. It's not real stress to have read the case in a law school class, but these students think so. They're ingrained to think that. I think the institution forces them to be a little bit like that because instead of focusing on things like public service, working for the public defender's office, there's statistics of who gets the highest paid jobs after third year. So it needs a reboot. The whole institution of law school, in my opinion, needs a reboot. But I am happy to say that at least Emory, because I've participated in one, has had a program trying to get students to focus on mental health and wellness.
That's fantastic. I've told many a law student that 90% of the class is not in the top 10%.
You're right.
It still works out.
It'll be okay.
Right, exactly.
When we're talking about younger people, to answer your question, Bianca, I think we can and we have to do better. I've spoken at Emory Law School. I've spoken at UGA. My understanding is that while they offer some discrete programming around law student well-being, there needs to be a much more holistic and continuous framework for this. The University of Pennsylvania Law School is doing that right now, and hopefully it's going to be a model for other law schools to follow because it's just sort of hit and miss right now. That's my sense of it anyway. These students are facing obstacles that I certainly didn't deal with, and the biggest one that comes up in my mind is huge debt loads because that really affects the choices that they can make. And, going back to the issue that keeps coming up throughout this conversation, the most isolated cohorts in this society are not the older folks. It's the millennials and the Gen Z. So you have these young people coming to law school, and the research tells us when we look at graduate students as a whole, there's no qualitative difference between law students and students in other disciplines. But by the time these law students get to their second year in law school, that's when we begin to see the shift that we were talking about before. These internal motivators and drivers that brought people to this profession, usually it's some version of, I want to be a value. I want to help people. They start to get supplanted by these external factors around law review, grades, the prestige of the law firm that I'm going to go with. And they're still, in the meantime, being held to the same standards that we all were. We can sit here on the other side with the benefit of hindsight and say, oh, being in the top 10% isn't really the end all and be all. But the reality of it is that a lot of opportunities are still reserved for students who achieve in that way. So they're the ones getting the big law offers. They're the ones getting the federal clerkship. That really hasn't changed. So, there's no question that young people and law students are struggling, and I'd love to see efforts dedicated toward helping enhance their well-being. But I will tell you, I have way too many 35, 40, and 50-year-old lawyers coming in my office, and they are really unhappy. They are really struggling. So I wouldn't want to say that we should shift our efforts to the law schools. I'd say we need to be able to do both and I know we can.
One thing I'll add is that when it comes to the young people, Bianca wrote something for the Daily Report a few years ago. We asked for advice from lawyers for people who've just passed the bar. And Bianca wrote an article that was titled, "You Will Fail." And I thought that was brilliant because I think a lot of people growing up, I certainly was one of them, really don't expect to fail. And once the prospect of failing is even in front of them, it causes great stress. And once you failed a couple of times, you realize that everything will be just fine. And how you respond to the failure is a lot more important than whether you made a misstep.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was actually very fun to write. I know it from personal experience. Mm-hmm. I've failed in my practice, but it really is about what you learn from that, how you grow, and it shapes us all as attorneys, for sure.
Well, one of the things I say to my clients who have experienced trauma, a level that failure may or may not rise to, is that you can't change what happens. In other words, we don't get over trauma. But what we can look for is post-traumatic growth, which is actually what creates resilience and strengths. And that's what I hear you saying. The bad news is that we don't grow through the good times nearly to the extent that we do the bad times. It's adversity that makes us stronger. It's just the way it is.
But we don't have to go through that adversity alone. That's been one of the things that I hear is one of the main points in this conversation, is that there are resources. There are opportunities for attorneys and people who within the profession to reach out, because there are ways that we can support each other and that the profession supports us.
Stacey, I'm curious, when you talk about Gen Y and Gen Z, what is your observation with regard to social media and how that affects your client's mood, and what do you recommend regarding those?
So it gets easier every day to demonize social media. And while I think that it can certainly create harm, I also think that it just depends on the circumstances. It's really hard to paint with a broad brush. If people have authentic interpersonal connection in their lives, then social media can be an adjunct that simply embellishes it, makes it richer. It's when people become so focused and fixated on the curated lives of others, and then they have the fear of missing out or the fear of being a failure, not being able to keep up with others and show up the way they want. That's when I think social media can really reinforce the sense of isolation. And then there's the fact that the research does show that social media, particularly Instagram for some reason, reinforces depression and anxiety, particularly among younger people. So while social media isn't the only culprit for these issues, sure, it's definitely a significant part of the picture.
One thing that strikes me always, I'm always pleased when I hear of stories about lawyers who pound each other with hammers in court, and then they go out for lunch, a week later. And I'm sure, Robin, you have stories like that.
Sure.
What does it take for that type of relationship to occur, and what are the barriers to it?
I would say mutual respect is the first thing, and a sense of humility, which is in short supply sometimes with lawyers. But I approach my opposing counsel, and I pride myself on having very good relationships with all of my opposing counsel. But I approach them with the same mutual respect. I want to hear their thoughts first. I use the 7 habits of highly effective people. You listen first, seek to listen, and then seek to understand, then be understood. That's one of the tenets I use when I talk with opposing counsel. But a sense of mutual respect, and that no one takes it personally. We are working. They have clients. They have a job to do, and they're going to work hard for that client. I have got a client. I'm going to work hard for my client. but we're not going to take it personally in the end, and we can still be friends. I tell my clients, it actually helps your case sometimes if I'm friends with the opposing counsel. Trust me. A lot of clients see it as like, wait, something's fishy about that. I'm like, no, it's a good thing that we get along and everything will be done by consent and easily. And trust me, this is good for your case. But a sense of mutual respect. And like tonight, for example, is Lawyers Club. Lawyers Club is a membership of 1,800 lawyers from all types of practices. So many of my opposing counsel will be there, but there will be judges, there will be prosecutors, public defenders, criminal defense attorneys, all walks of our professional life. And it's a place where we can not talk about cases, but just talk about family, what's going on in your life, catching up with each other. And tonight is a great night. We're going to honor the members who have practiced for 50 years. Well, we can set these folks up who have practiced for 50 years, still a member of our club, and say, be like these people. They've done it the right way. I really love tonight's thing. But talking about social connection, Lawyers Club is a great example, especially as a sole practitioner. I need outlets like that where I can go and have the collegiality of other members and talk with them.
I think that's a great point, Robin, in terms of how we engage with each other when we're not in a courtroom. This weekend, the Gate City Bar has a community law clinic at Greenbrier Mall that I'm excited to participate in because it gives me the opportunity to interact with other attorneys in a way where we're all working together for the community's betterment. And those opportunities are out there. And I think that it lends to what Stacey was saying earlier about we need to socialize with each other. And so getting the opportunity to see our fellow attorneys in a different light, to socialize with them, to work with them instead of against them, I think all those things lend to a better practice and better overall well-being.
If I can just add something, I love the way Robin was talking about how she talks to her clients. A couple of months ago, I was meeting with associates from a big law firm. And so I said to these folks, I'm like, so, everybody talks about you millennials, how you want a sense of connection and belongingness at work. Do you see yourselves as you ascend into leadership levels, being able to change the culture in terms of it being more amenable to work-life integration, to connectivity? And to a person, they all shook their heads no. And they said, basically, as long as we feel that clients are the tail that wags the dog of the law firm, we don't see how it can change. And what we know is that many lawyers continue to believe that, well, you got to do whatever the client demands. And while to a certain extent that's true, I think we miss opportunities to model behavior for our clients that might help simmer down emotions, because clients are very activated a lot of times when we're with them. And we can actually, instead of escalating with them, we can actually kind of help bring them back to baseline and help them see the bigger picture. So in those ways, it might help to explain why it might be to their benefit that we're friends with co-counsel, like Robin was saying. Because, we know that stress is contagious. So when you have a client who comes to your office who is brimming over and really stressed out, if the lawyer isn't careful, it's really easy to get jacked up by their emotional response. And what might it be like if at that moment we have the capacity to say, let's just sit down and talk about it. Let's put it in context and evaluate it. We can review your options and just bring the temperature down. I mean, what a difference compared to the feeling that as long as the client is out there ahead of us, we got to chase them. I don't know, maybe it sounds like pie in the sky, but I think it's an area we could really work on.
Actually, there was a general counsel I spoke to a few weeks ago for a story about a different part of this story, which is that transactional lawyers in particular are feeling totally stressed out because the speed of their work has increased exponentially. The perfect example is that 30 years ago, if they were doing a deal, they would wait for a FedEx package to arrive, then they would look over the negotiated, the papers, and then they would send it back. And they would have at least a day to think about it. And now, some people are saying they're losing business if they can't give a potential client, an answer to their question in 30 minutes. And one general counsel said he wants his outside counsel to think about their answers and that it's his job to manage his client, meaning the executives at his company, to manage their expectations and to explain that this is going to take some time to research. A lawyer at one of the big firms said, she was very smart. She said, I like to tell people this is what I think this is, but, I need a little bit of time to confirm it. If you're looking for the direction to go, that's a reasonable direction to go with your business decision, but, I'm going to need to confirm it depending on what state you're in or something like that.
Unfortunately, many lawyers worry that if they don't have the answer off the top of their head, it looks like weakness. Again, asking questions is a sign of weakness, not strength. And there's a researcher named Cal Newport from Georgetown who does work in this area that he calls deep work. And he talks about how challenged knowledge workers are by the need to continue to be able to do that work at a deep level, this cognitive work, in environments that are just racked with distractions and interruptions that literally prevent us from doing the work that we need to do. So we wind up doing what he calls shallow work by default because we lack the capacity and opportunity to really drop into the work like we need to. And not only does that prevent us from getting the actual work that we need to get done, the studies show that being relegated to the shallow work actually drives a lot of the depression and anxiety that we've been talking about throughout this entire conversation.
All right, friends, this has been such a powerful and much needed conversation about a critical issue that affects attorneys at every level. I hope that for those listening, that they feel inspired and compelled to continue this dialogue and seek help if needed, and also to help those in need by sharing resources and the information that they've heard in this episode. Are there any parting thoughts or something you'd like to share before we sign off?
Robin, what's the phone number?
The Georgia Lawyer Assistance phone number is 800-327-9631, and the suicide hotline is 800-784-2433. When I give a talk about this, I always like to say, put in your contacts in your phone under suicide, the number. So you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think, what was that Georgia Lawyers program called again? You just suicide, and you can go right to it. Always have that number. It may be for you. It may be for a family member. It may be for a friend. And I have this happen. Lawyers call me because I've kind of become the face of suicide prevention, but lawyers will call me and say, my child is at college and needs help. What should I do? Call this number. That's what I tell them. So always have it handy. It's a good thing to do, I think.
Thank you. Great
Thank you.
conversation.
This has been great.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with everyone.
You've been listening to The Future of Resolution, the podcast. You can follow The Future of Resolution on Miles Mediation and Arbitration's Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and subscribe, rate, or review this podcast. Join us soon for another interesting discussion. Thank you for listening.